I never thought the cruelest moment of my life would repeat itself 30 years later, and the exact same way. Yesterday, I was clearing tables at the Evergreen Country Club, the air thick with the scent of roasted garlic and old money. Still wearing the black skirt and crisp white blouse they make the mature waitstaff wear when a new member sat down at table 12. The chandeliers were dimmed low, casting golden pools across the linen, and the hum of privileged laughter filled the room. He reached for the leather-bound wine list, his sleeves slid up just enough, and there it was, the tiny crescent-moon birthmark on his right wrist, pale and perfect against his skin. The same mark I have hidden beneath my watch every day for 3 decades. The same mark my newborn son had the night they told me he didn't survive. My tray slipped from my fingers and crashed to the floor. Crystal shattered everywhere, sharp and glittering like broken ice under the lights. The sound cut through the dining room chatter like a scream. 30 years disappeared in a heartbeat, and I was 24 again, standing in that sterile delivery room, holding a baby who had already gone cold. If you've ever felt your entire world tilt because of one tiny detail, stay with me. If my story resonates even a little, please subscribe to the channel. There are more like this, and I don't want you to miss what comes next. I'm Catherine Harper, 54 years old, and for the last 7 years, I've been serving prime rib and 25-year-old scotch to the same crowd that used to invite me to their Christmas parties. After my divorce from Richard Langford, yes, that Langford, of Langford and Associates, I walked away with nothing but my clothes, my grandmother's silver candlesticks, and a mountain of debt he made sure the judge believed was mine alone. The Evergreen doesn't usually hire women my age for the main dining room. They want fresh faces that make the members feel young. But when your ex destroyed your reputation and your references still carry the old zip code, people make exceptions. I learned to smile through the pity, through the whispers that floated behind manicured hands, through the occasional, "Catherine, darling, how the mighty have fallen," delivered with a sympathetic tilt of the head and eyes that wouldn't quite meet mine. I learned to keep my spine straight and my voice soft. I learned to disappear, even while standing right in front of them, holding their martinis. That night, the dining room was packed, some retirement celebration for a hedge fund legend. The air smelled of seared beef and lilies from the centerpieces, and the string quartet in the corner played something soft and forgettable. Table 12 was reserved for Alexander Grant, the new member everyone was buzzing about. 33, self-made, private equity king who just bought the old Vanderbilt estate on the North Shore. Nobody really knew him yet, but money like that buys instant curiosity, and the room kept glancing over like moths to a porch light. I approached with the water pitcher steady this time, though my palms were slick against the silver handle. "Good evening, Mr. Grant. Still or sparkling?" He glanced up from his phone, and the overhead light caught the gray blue of his eyes, my mother's eyes. My eyes, now looking out at me from a stranger's face. "Still, please." And the chef's tasting menu. His voice was low, cultured, confident without arrogance. When he reached for the menu, his cuff of his navy suit shifted again, and I saw it a second time, the crescent moon, pale against tan skin, exactly where mine sits. My hand shook so badly I overfilled his glass. Water spilled across the white tablecloth like a blood stain, blooming, dark and unstoppable. "I'm so sorry, sir. I'll have this changed immediately." My voice came out thin, almost foreign in my own ears. "It's fine," he said, not unkindly, dabbing at the spill with his napkin. "Accidents happen." But it wasn't an accident. It was recognition. It was terror. It was the ghost of every sleepless night since April 12th, 1992, rising up and wrapping its cold fingers around my throat. My chest tightened so hard I thought I might faint right there beside the breadbasket. because that birthmark isn't common. The neonatal nurse told me once, her voice gentle as she wrapped my son in a blanket, that shaped birthmarks occur in less than 1% of babies, and crescents are the rarest of all. I have one, my son had one, and now this man, this stranger, had one in the exact same place. I could almost feel the hospital blanket again, soft flannel against my cheek, the weight of 4 pounds 2 ounces in my arms, the tiny perfect wrist with its pale moon. I spent the rest of the evening in a fog, moving through the motions while my mind screamed. Every time I passed his table, I cataloged the details like a madwoman. The way his dark hair fell across his forehead when he read the dessert card. The slight cleft in his chin that was pure Richard. Richard who used to kiss that spot on Sunday mornings before the world woke up. The gray-blue eyes that looked silver under the chandeliers, my mother's eyes, my eyes, now looking out at me from a stranger's face. When he signed the check, the name on the black Amex read A.J. Grant. A for Alexander, J for James. The middle name Richard and I had chosen the day we found out I was having a boy, sitting on the floor of the brownstone nursery, surrounded by paint swatches and impossible dreams. By the time I clocked out at 11:30, I was trembling so hard I could barely zip my coat. The night air hit my face like cold water, and I sat in my 10-year-old Honda in the staff lot, the engine ticking as it cooled. I pulled the ultrasound photo from my glove compartment, the only picture I have of my son. Grainy, faded, the paper soft from years of being touched in the dark. The tech had circled the tiny wrist and written, "Cute little moon," with a smiley face. I pressed it to my chest and cried like I hadn't cried since the night they told me he was gone. Great, ugly sobs that shook the steering wheel. I didn't sleep. How could I? At 5 a.m., I was back at the club, polishing silver that didn't need polishing, the clink of forks against metal the only sound in the empty dining room. The scent of lemon polish stung my eyes, or maybe that was just the tears that wouldn't stop. I kept seeing that wrist, that moon, those eyes. When he walked into the grill room at 7:15 sharp, sunlight slanting through the windows and catching the dust motes like tiny stars, I was ready with the carafe. My hand shook only slightly. "Good morning, Mr. Grant. Coffee?" He looked up, surprised to see me again, and something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe, or simple curiosity. "You're working a double?" "Couldn't sleep," I said, and the honesty slipped out before I could stop it, raw and trembling in the quiet room. Something in his expression softened. He set down his phone and looked at me, really looked, and I felt suddenly naked under the fluorescent lights. "Join me for a minute?" He gestured to the empty chair across from him, his voice gentle but firm. "I have a feeling we need to talk." My legs nearly gave out. The room smelled of bacon and fresh coffee, familiar and safe, but nothing felt safe anymore. I glanced around, no managers in sight, just the distant clatter of the kitchen waking up, and slid into the chair like a woman stepping off a cliff, my heart hammering so loud I was sure he could hear it. He didn't waste time. He leaned forward slightly, forearms on the table, and fixed me with those silver blue eyes. "You recognized the birthmark last night." It wasn't a question. "I have the same one," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator behind the bar. "And so did my son. He was born April 12th, 1992, at St. Mary's Hospital. They told me he died 8 hours later. His name was Alexander James Langford." The color drained from his face so completely I thought he might pass out. He set his coffee cup down with deliberate care, the porcelain clicking softly against the saucer. For a long moment he just stared at me, and I watched the same shock I'd felt the night before bloom across his features. "My adoptive parents told me I was born April 12th, 1992, he said finally, his voice low and careful, like he was handling something fragile. "My original birth certificate lists St. Mary's. My biological mother's name was redacted. My biological father's name was listed as Richard Langford. The room spun. The sunlight suddenly felt too bright, the smell of coffee too strong. I gripped the edge of the table to keep from sliding to the floor, my knuckles white against the dark wood. He leaned forward, voice dropping even lower. I think we need to get a DNA test. Today. That small turn, him taking control, him believing me without hesitation, without making me feel crazy, was the first time in 30 years someone had handed me back a piece of power. The air between us felt charged, electric, like the moment before a storm breaks. I nodded, tears streaming silently down my cheeks, tasting salt when we reached my lips. We drove separately to a private lab in the city, the morning traffic a blur of horns and brake lights. He paid for the expedited results, 48 hours. While the technician swabbed our cheeks, the cotton cool against my skin, he looked at me and said the words I'd waited my entire adult life to hear. His voice soft but steady. Whatever this test says, Catherine, I'm glad I met you. I cried again in the parking garage, great heaving sobs that echoed off the concrete walls. He let me, standing a respectful distance away, hands in his pockets, until I could breathe again. Then he opened his passenger door, the leather seat warm from the sun. Come on, breakfast, my treat, somewhere that isn't the club. We ended up at a tiny diner on the waterfront, the kind of place that still smells like bacon grease and strong coffee no matter how many times they repaint. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp in the salt air. He ordered pancakes swimming in syrup. I couldn't eat. My stomach was a knot of hope and terror. We sat in silence until the waitress left, her sneakers squeaking on the linoleum. Then he spoke, voice gentle. Tell me about him. About my father. I wrapped my cold hands around my coffee mug, feeling the heat seep into my palms. Richard was brilliant, I said, the words tasting like rust. A corporate attorney on the partner track before he was 35. Charismatic. Everyone loved him. When I told him I was pregnant, he smiled in front of people. But that night, he sat me down in our perfect kitchen with the sub-zero fridge and explained very calmly why a baby would ruin everything. His career, our lifestyle. The way he looked at me like I'd deliberately sabotaged his future still turns my stomach 30 years later. Alex, listened without interrupting, his fork still in the syrup, eyes never leaving my face. He wanted me to terminate. I refused. My voice cracked on the last word, and I hated myself for it. When I went into labor at 26 weeks, he was furious, said I'd done this on purpose by stressing myself with concerts. I was a violinist, second chair with the symphony before I married him. He made me give it up the year we got engaged, said it was embarrassing for his colleagues to see his wife performing like a student. I swallowed hard, the diner suddenly too warm. They rushed me to St. Mary's. Everything after the epidural is a blur, the fluorescent lights too bright, the beeping machines, Richard pacing in his perfect suit while I screamed. I remember holding a tiny, perfect boy. 4 pounds, 2 ounces, 10 perfect fingers. That beautiful crescent moon on his right wrist. Then they took him away to the NICU. Hours later, Dr. Elaine Carter came in alone, her face blank. She said there had been a catastrophic brain bleed, that he was gone. Richard stood at the foot of the bed and thanked her for trying, his voice perfectly steady, while I came apart at the seams. Alex's jaw was tight, a muscle jumping in his cheek. I've always had a scar on the back of my head, he said quietly. My parents, adoptive parents, said I had surgery shortly after birth for a subdural hematoma. They told me my biological mother couldn't cope with a potentially disabled child and signed away rights. I laughed, a broken sound that made the waitress glance over. There was never any bleed. You cried when they put you in my arms. I felt it, your tiny hand wrapped around my finger like you were holding on for dear life. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his, warm and steady. The first time anyone had touched me with kindness in so long I almost pulled away. "We're going to find out exactly what happened," he said, voice like steel wrapped in velvet. "And then Richard Langford is going to answer for it." 2 days later, the results came back. 99.9997% probability of maternity. My son was alive. My son was sitting across from me, drinking coffee and calling me Catherine because Mom felt too strange for both of us right now, too big for the space between us. We didn't celebrate. We planned. Alex hired investigators quietly. Within a week, we had Dr. Elaine Carter's current address, a retirement community in Scottsdale, all terracotta roofs and golf carts. We had hospital records that had been sealed but not destroyed, the paper yellowed and smelling of old ink. And we had a bombshell, a deposit of $250,000 from Langford and Associates into an account belonging to Dr. Carter's daughter, dated 1 week after my son's death. The minor revenge came faster than I expected, and it tasted sweeter than I wanted to admit. Alex discovered Richard was trying to poach him as a client, wanted to handle the legal work for Alex's newest acquisition, some 8-figure deal that would have been a crown jewel for the firm. Alex scheduled a lunch at the Evergreen, requested table 12 specifically, and asked that I be assigned. When the day came, the dining room smelled of rosemary and red wine, sunlight slanting through the windows and catching the dust motes like gold. The day Richard walked in, his Italian loafers silent on the carpet, I was waiting with the breadbasket, my hands steady for the first time in days. He froze when he saw me, the color draining from his face so fast I thought he might drop. "Catherine." "Richard." I smiled, the professional smile I'd perfected over 7 years of serving men like him, the one that never reached my eyes. "Sparkling or still?" His face went the color of ash. Alex rose from the table, hand extended, every inch the billionaire now. "Mr. Langford, Alexander Grant, I believe you knew my mother." Richard looked from Alex to me and back again, and for the first time in my life, I watched the great Richard Langford, the man who'd once reduced judges to stammering with a single raised eyebrow, completely speechless. The room around us seemed to hold its breath. "Sit down, Richard," I said softly, but there was iron beneath the velvet now. "We have 30 years to discuss." He sat, the leather chair creaking under his weight. Alex laid the folder on the table with deliberate care, the sound loud in the sudden silence. Inside, the DNA results printed on heavy cream stock, the financial trail with dates and amounts circled in red, the original nursing notes that documented a healthy, premature boy with APGAR scores of 8 and 9, transferred to a private transport per father's request. Richard tried bluster first, his voice too loud in the quiet room. "This is preposterous, some kind of shakedown." "No," Alex cut in, voice like steel wrapped in silk. "This is consequences." I leaned forward, close enough to smell his cologne, the same creed he'd worn since business school, and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. "You told me my son died. You let me bury an empty box while you sold him to the highest bidder. You paid a doctor to fake records and told me my child was dead because a disabled child would have been inconvenient for your perfect life." Richard's hands shook as he reached for his water glass, ice clinking. "Catherine, you were 24. Your career was taking off. The baby was early. There were risks." "There were no risks," I said, and my voice didn't shake at all. "You manufactured them. Because a disabled child would have embarrassed you at the club. Because a child at all would have slowed you down. You decided I wasn't good enough to be his mother, so you took him from me." He looked at Alex, pleading now, the man who'd once held my heart in his manicured hands reduced to begging. "You have to understand. Your adoptive parents were desperate. They'd lost 3 pregnancies. It seemed merciful." "Merciful?" Alex's voice was lethal quiet, the kind that made boardrooms fall silent. "You stole 30 years from the only parent who wanted me, from the woman who sang to me every night she was pregnant, who practiced scales with her violin resting on her belly so I'd know music before I was born." Richard tried to stand, his chair scraping back. "I should leave." "Sit down," I said it with every ounce of steel I'd forged working tables while he lived in our mansion with his new wife and new life. You will listen to what you did to me. And he did. I told him about the funeral I planned alone because he was too devastated to help, choosing the tiniest white casket while he golfed in Scotland, about visiting a grave with no body for 15 years, leaving daffodils that wilted in the spring sun, about the night I tried to end my own life with his sleeping pills and woke up vomiting because even that I couldn't do right, about serving his new wife's friends while they pretended not to recognize me, their diamonds flashing as they ordered salads they barely touched. When I finished, the dining room was silent. Members at nearby tables had stopped pretending not to listen, forks suspended halfway to their mouths. Richard's eyes were glassy, his perfect tan suddenly sallow. "I thought I was protecting everyone," he whispered, the same lie he told himself for 30 years. "You are protecting yourself," Alex said, and the cold finality in his voice made me shiver. "And now you're going to make it right." He slid a second folder across the table, the paper crisp and official. Inside was a resignation letter from Langford and Associates, effective immediately. A transfer of his partnership share to a new foundation, Harper Grant Family Restoration Fund, and a sworn affidavit detailing every step of the deception, to be held in trust and released only if he ever contested the terms. "Sign," Alex said, placing a Mont Blanc pen beside it, like a dagger. Richard looked at me, his eyes pleading for mercy I no longer had. "Catherine, you don't get to say my name anymore," I told him, and the words tasted like freedom. "Sign." His pen shook so badly, the first signature was illegible, ink bleeding into the paper like tears. The second was not. When he was done, Alex stood, towering over the table. "You'll receive instructions for the rest. Do not contact my mother again. Ever." Richard left without another word, his shoulders bowed like an old man's. The dining room slowly resumed its chatter, but I could feel eyes on us, the weight of 30 years finally lifting from my chest. Alex paid the check, then turned to me, his face softening for the first time since we'd sat down. "Are you okay?" I realized I was smiling, really smiling, the kind that started somewhere deep and worked its way out. For the first time in 30 years, I felt steady. Yes, I think I am. The months that followed were a whirlwind, but the kind that sweeps clean instead of destroys. The foundation launched quietly, but grew fast, our first grant helping a mother in Ohio reunite with the daughter she'd been told died at birth 28 years earlier. Every reunion felt like a small piece of my own heart healing, like scar tissue finally softening. I quit the club the next week. Diana, my old manager, cried when I gave notice, hugging me so hard my apron strings cut into my waist. She'd known something big was coming, but never guessed the whole truth. "You deserve this, Katie," she whispered into my hair. "All of it." Alex insisted I move out of my cramped apartment that smelled of old takeout and regret. Not into luxury, I refused, stubborn to the last, but into a sunny 2-bedroom on the part, with windows that actually opened and a fireplace that worked. My first purchase with foundation money was a second-hand Steinway, its wood warm and honey-colored under my fingers. The first piece I played on it was Brahms' Lullaby, the one I hummed to my belly when I was pregnant, tears streaming down my face as the notes filled the empty rooms. Some nights Alex comes over and we cook together, bumping hips in my tiny kitchen while something simmers on the stove. He's terrible at chopping onions, but tries anyway, laughing when they make his eyes water. We talk about everything and nothing, his first heartbreak at 16, the way I used to sneak into symphony rehearsals pregnant and glowing, the books we both love. He still calls me Catherine most of the time, but sometimes, when he's tired or thoughtful and the city lights are flickering outside my windows, it slips out softer, "Mom," and neither of us corrects it. The word hangs in the air like a promise we're both still learning how to keep. 1 year to the day after Richard signed those papers, Alex took me back to St. Mary's. The hospital had built a new maternity wing, all glass and light and hope.
We dedicated a small garden courtyard tucked between buildings, roses just beginning to bud despite the late frost. The plaque reads, "For every mother told her child was gone, for every child told their mother couldn't keep them, may you find your way home. In memory of the years we lost, Catherine Harper and Alexander Grant." There's a crescent moon engraved beneath the words, small and perfect, catching the sunlight. That night we had dinner on my tiny balcony, the city spread out below us like a blanket of stars. Snow was falling, the soft, quiet kind that makes the world feel gentle for once, melting on our eyelashes as we raised our glasses. He looked at me across the candle flame, eyes soft. "To the truth." I touched my glass to his, the chime clear and true in the cold air. "To the truth. And to whatever comes next." Because for the first time since I was 24 years old, standing in a hospital room holding a miracle they told me was gone, I believe there is a next. If you've ever lost a piece of yourself and somehow found it again years later, if you know what it feels like to wake up one morning and realize the weight you've carried for decades has finally, miraculously lifted, please share your story in the comments. You're not alone. And if this touched you, subscribe. There are so many more stories of impossible second chances waiting. We're just getting started.